Parents, be warned. The government is launching a new offensive to push radical sexuality and gender ideology at your children, which, when you see the full program, you won't be too comfortable with. In fact, you may be quite angry. Now, the government is calling it a new approach.
The government's released a fresh set of guidelines to bring sex education into the 21st century.
There'll be a greater focus around consent and porn.
Sex education in schools is getting an overhaul with new information released today for teaching topics like consent, pornography and gender diversity.
There's your first red flag, gender diversity. In other words, radical gender theory being indoctrinated into children as young as 5. Kids can be told they can choose their sex and that mummy and daddy may treat them as a boy because they were born a boy, but they're wrong. Well, there's nothing new or fresh or improved about this new resource. It's the same curriculum that was released just over a year ago and that we have previously reviewed. So let's review again exactly what this refreshed, improved curriculum actually says. Because parents, you need to be on the alert. The Relationships and Sexuality Education Guidelines, or RSE for short, were released by the Ministry of Education in September 2020. Now, despite being well-intentioned with an aim to create more inclusive school environments and reduce bullying, these proposals are for the most part ideological. And while their content is portrayed as scientific, they actually have no basis in science. And this should be concerning to all parents and caregivers. Primary age students are being targeted with the confusing and dangerous message that changing sex is as easy as changing clothes. Girls are discovering that biological boys have free access to their changing rooms, and the curriculum states that parents are able to be kept in the dark when their child has decided to identify as transgender during the school day. Now, you can read the full analysis in our 30-page report. But in the new curriculum for primary age children, requirements include students should be addressed by their preferred names and pronouns. Schools need to ensure that students can access toilets and changing rooms that align with their gender identification. Trans students should not be required to use a gender-neutral toilet rather than the male or female toilets of their choice. Teachers should challenge sex norms. For example, the assumption that sex characteristics at birth are always male or female. And teachers should challenge homophobia, transphobia, sexism, gender binaries, even interrogate the ongoing effects of colonisation. They want 7 and 8-year-old children to be able to identify gender stereotypes, understand the difference between gender and sex, and know that there are diverse gender and sexual identities in society. They also teach that there are more than 2 genders, labelling the assumption that there are only 2 genders, girl-boy or man-woman, incorrect. But it's not only in health classes. They want this ideology, this indoctrination, in all parts of the primary school classroom, all subjects. In science, your child will consider how biological sex has been constructed and measured over time, and consider variations in puberty, including the role of hormone blockers. Do you really want your primary age child being indoctrinated on how biological sex has been constructed and the role of hormone blockers? Were you thinking about these issues when you were at primary school? In technology, your child will identify how gender expectations are embedded in technology, for example, in the design and style of power tools and other tools. Yep, those annoying male and female plugs and connections. And they will explore symbols linked to the gay and transgender rights movement. In the social sciences, your child will be encouraged to explore the development and persistence of gender stereotypes, for example, by researching the Me Too movement. In English, engage in dialogue and debate in the context of provocative online posts linked to relationships, gender, and sexuality. Again, remember, this is for a primary age audience. As you can see, the content inserted into every other subject is not relevant to their learning. It verges on the ridiculous. It's actually a clear attempt at imposing or indoctrinating their worldview on your children. Schools are meant to be places of education, not indoctrination, and politics, where they're more focused on teaching your children to become defenders of leftist radical ideology. And what is most significant is that there is no attempt to include opposing views in the curriculum. For example, that no, you just can't choose your gender. Now, as our report says, instead of being taught that questions and confusion around gender and puberty and growing up is normal, that we all went through it, and that they will come to accept their biological sex as it is, your child will be socialised to believe that confusion about one's gender is a sign that they could be stuck in the wrong gender, born in the wrong body, and that it is part and parcel of pubertal change for them to want to change who they are in order to become the right gender. This is reflected in the Year 7 and 8 teaching. That's intermediate school age, where the guidelines want preteens to know about pubertal change, including hormonal change, menstruation, body development, and the development of gender identities. When it comes to gender confusion and dysphoria, if we enableise, normalise and encourage this kind of behaviour, as the Ministry of Education would have us do, we should not be at all surprised at the harm these young people inflict upon themselves because we refuse to tell them the truth, and that it sadly becomes more severe and in some cases irreversible. In fact, here's a quick look at some of the words in the glossary of terms that they want to be used in primary schools. Asexual, bisexual, cisgender, heteronormativity, intersex, non-binary, pansexual, sex assigned at birth, transitioning, transsexual. Yep, apparently every 5 to 9-year-old needs to know all those. Apparently. Oh, and their translation into Pacific languages as well, Cook Island, Tongan, Samoan. Do Pacifica families actually want this teaching? And as I've highlighted in a recent episode of McBlog, the Ministry of Education has recommended that schools normalise transgender identities, consider ways to increase the use of gender-diverse language in the classroom, and says that using gendered language such as girls and boys, ladies and gentlemen, can be alienating for gender non-conforming and gender-diverse students. Well, this is not from Disney. This is straight from the Ministry of Education. Teachers are encouraged by the ministry to keep a child's mental health issues secret from their parents by allowing the child to adopt a new persona while at school, including the use of preferred pronouns without having necessarily to inform the parents that there are identity issues. As you can see here, they specifically advise teachers to ask young people, check with the student about the name and or pronouns they want to be used in the records that parents or caregivers may see, as they might be different to the ones they use at school. In case you need reminding, and I'm sure you don't, parents raise their children. Yes, there's some sad exceptions to that, but the state should not be the de facto parents, and definitely should not be undermining your authority. What I also find interesting in all of this is that these programs are often marketed around anti-bullying and inclusivity. But the reason that most schools reject these extreme programs is because schools are keen to deal with the bullying issue, but they're taking a full school community approach. These programs are not inclusive, they're actually exclusive. They only focus on a very small group of students and ignore the far greater population of students who are bullied for the more common reasons of body image, racial background, disabilities, and academic success or failure, and of course the major prevalence of cyberbullying. Unfortunately, overweight students with acne or a speech impediment or a physical disability, or who are struggling academically, or students from a different culture, they don't have a lobby group or a letter of the alphabet. Their cause is not politically sexy enough. But depression and suicide are also associated with these types of bullying. So schools are correct to focus on all bullying. But what is most ironic about these relationship and sexuality education programs is that any student that doesn't buy into the groupthink on gender ideology that is expected and dictated, even if it doesn't affect the way they relate with other students, they'll immediately be bullied themselves with terms such as homophobic, transphobic, and bigoted. Getting rid of all bullying is obviously not the key message of these groups. Now, before I conclude with a strategy for parents to tackle this issue, let me show you a couple of other examples of materials that could find their way into your child's classroom, but only if you sit back and let them. Firstly, there's Family Planning's Navigating the Journey. It's probably a journey that you won't be keen on joining them on. It's saturated with gender ideology and also contains material for primary school children that you probably think is up to you as a parent to talk with your children about. Here's a few examples. For new entrants, and learning all the Māori words for these as well. For years 3 to 4, so this is for years 7 to 8-year-olds. But the gender ideology indoctrination begins at 7 years old. Introduce the words sex, gender, stereotypes, and gender roles to the students. Sex refers to how a person's body is classified based on genitals, chromosomes, gonads, etc. Sex and gender are not the same thing, although commonly mistaken to be. Gender, our sense of being a man or a woman or someone else. It may not be the same as the sex we were assigned at birth and is influenced by society and culture. And then they want your 7-year-old to watch this lovely children's book.
Who are you? When babies are born, people ask, is it a boy or a girl? Babies can't talk, so grown-ups make a guess by looking at their bodies. This is the sex assigned to you at birth, male or female. Sometimes people get this confused with gender, but gender is much more than the body you were born with. Some people say there are only 2 genders, but there are really many genders. You are who you say you are because you know you best. For some people, the grown-ups guessed right about their body and their gender. This is called cisgender, when someone's identity matches their sex assigned at birth. And for some people, there are more than just 2 choices. These are just a few words people use. Trans, genderqueer, non-binary, gender fluid, transgender, gender neutral, agender, neutros, bigender, third gender, two-spirit, and there are even more words.
Unbelievable. Apparently there's even more words. And there's this one, Introducing Teddy.
A gentle story about gender and friendship. I need to be myself, Errol. In my heart, I have always known that I'm a girl, Teddy, not a boy, Teddy. I wish my name was Tilly, not Thomas.
It's pretty obvious, isn't it? It's radical indoctrination of 7-year-olds. Now for years 5 and 6, so this is 9 to 10 years old, there's these types of activities. And you'll see at this level a continued and stronger push for gender ideology. Remind the students that gender refers to the gender a person identifies with. For example, girl, boy, both, woman, man, non-binary, transgender, takatapui, or queer, which may or may not match their biological sex. We learn how we act from people in society. Sometimes someone who looks like a boy may actually feel like a girl, and vice versa. Some people don't feel they are either a boy or a girl, and that's okay too. Remember, this is 9-year-olds. Then there's this fun exercise. Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that your gender has changed. What would that be like? How would your life be the same? How would it be different? Would any of your ambitions change? What could be some negatives about living with this new gender? And what could be some positives? And finally, years 7 to 8. So this is intermediate age, about 11 and 12 years old. And apart from the so-called safe sex method, the teacher guideline says, explain that when we become sexually active, we should get regular tests and checks to monitor our health, just as we go to the dentist to have our teeth checked. Where might someone go to have these checks? Students need to know that doctors can provide contraceptives to young people under the age of 16, and this service is confidential. Yes, we don't want those pesky parents being informed. Highlight the fact that if the students are thinking about having sex, did I mention that this is for 11 to 12-year-olds? It's important to talk to their doctor or nurse about how to keep themselves and their partner safe. It doesn't matter whether they're in a same-sex or an opposite-sex couple. Any couple is at risk of STIs. Identify the services in your area that can provide free support and make them known to your 11 and 12-year-old students. For young teens starting at secondary school, it's these types of activity cards. Still want to go on this journey with family planning? Then there's the Keeping Ourselves Safe program, which is run under the banner of the New Zealand Police. And look, much of that program is very, very good, but unfortunately, gender ideology and indoctrination is present in this program also. Under the heading Gender Identity, teachers should not make assumptions about children's gender identity. Some phrases you could use are, some children have a penis, some children have a vulva vagina, rather than boys have a penis, girls have a vulva vagina. Use genitals rather than penis vagina when the type of genital is unknown. Don't assume that a male presenting child will have a penis. Use parents, whānau or caregivers rather than mum and dad. We've also been asked about the Mates and Dates program in schools. Now, this is an ACC program for secondary schools only, and once again, while there's some good information around healthy relationships and the harms of drugs and alcohol, it's still disappointing that little consultation was done with parents to find out what their role is and how parents can be equipped to be the first teachers. It's also concerning that it's linked closely to the Ministry of Education's Sexuality education curriculum, with a push on issues such as identity, gender, and sexuality, including the use of the flawed and misleading genderbread person. There's a fuller analysis on our website. We'd also warn parents to stay well clear of Inside Out, which is a Rainbow Youth program, and The Real Sex Talk, produced by Lizzie Marvelly and others. Yeah, enough said or seen. And some of you will be aware of a recent Family Matters episode on a possible new program coming into your children's schools entitled The Pleasure Project. And the reason that we know that this is quite likely is because it's being endorsed by the same academics and groups behind these other resources that we've covered. The Pleasure Project is an international not-for-profit group on a mission to get sex educators hooked on talking dirty and embrace desire, joy, happiness and pleasure in sex education. We can have safer sex if we know how to have good sex. The Pleasure Project wants to provide sex education with the emphasis on sex, not education. And a closer look at their website shows a direct link between their education programs and sites that are pornographic in nature and material. We'll put the link to that episode in the details online so that you can see a more detailed analysis. But you have been warned. We should all be alarmed at the liberal gender ideologies being taught or recommended by academic activists via the Ministry of Education. And it doesn't look like improving anytime soon. In fact, the only good thing is that it's not compulsory yet. The government is reviewing that in 2024. But most schools want nothing to do with this extreme agenda. So how do we respond? How can a parent protect their child from this indoctrination and confusion? We recently published a resource responding to the transgender issue, Parent Resource Guide. It was designed to educate and assist parents. And it's not just on the transgender ideology, but around the whole area of sexuality and identity. Transgender activists are pushing an agenda to our youngest children that insists the body should be remade to conform with feelings. But a better and more compassionate and honest approach would be for schools to create a climate that welcomes every child by making room for a greater diversity of personalities without negating the importance of bodily sex and without denying biology. And more importantly, respecting the rights, role and responsibility of the parents and wider whānau. Now, this guide is designed to help parents understand the basics of the transgender trend and its consequences, understand the implications of transgender activism and gender inclusion type policies in schools. It explains parental rights and the rights of your children, and gives parents the tools to communicate with school leaders in order to create a respectful school environment and advocate for common sense policies that will respect the dignity of all students. And it helps schools act with compassion towards everyone involved in the conversation. The guide offers a wealth of constructive ideas for parents who want to work with their schools in a respectful manner to foster a genuinely inclusive climate based on truth and compassion. Now, you can download this guide for free from our website. So, parents, grandparents, guardians, here's your strategy. Contact your child's school and ask what content their classes will be covering. Be proactive. Closely monitor the classroom material. Be aware of what your child is learning and what homework assignments they may be asked to complete. Now, that was one good thing about the lockdown, wasn't it? We got to see firsthand some of the resources that were being given to our children. Liaise with the school's Board of Trustees to let them know, respectfully, if and why you are concerned. Remember, they're parents also. Ask your children what they're learning about gender, sex and relationships. If all else fails, don't forget you can withdraw your child from specific classes. You have that legal right. There was actually one good sentence in the guidelines which were just released by the ministry. It said this: "It is not considered good practice to hand over the responsibility for RSE or other units of learning and health education to external providers." That's good. Keeping radical groups like Inside Out, Family Planning and Rainbow Youth out of the classroom is a positive. Check to ensure that this is happening. These government-sanctioned programs targeted at children as young as 5 undermine the role and value of parents. They push a radical leftist sexuality and gender ideology, and the resources fail to take into account the emotional and physical development of each child and the values of their particular family. Do you know for sure what your children are being taught regarding whether they're male or female, a boy or a girl? Does your school allow students to use toilets, changing rooms and overnight accommodation and play in sports teams based on gender identity? Does the school's current sex education curricula cover gender identity or transgender identification at all? Have you reviewed those materials? You may be shocked by what you find out, or what you can't get information about when you ask. Unless you can absolutely guarantee that your school leadership is adopting a first do no harm policy with sexuality and gender, is regularly consulting with you and other parents in the school community, and can guarantee that groups like Family Planning and Rainbow Youth aren't being allowed access to the classroom to push their propaganda, if you can't guarantee those things, then we would recommend withdrawing your child from those classes. Hoping for the best may not be worth the risk. And if, when you request information or ask for copies of the curriculum, you get mucked around or they refuse to show you the resources, that's an immediate red flag. Oh, the academics and the government organisations and radical groups overseeing this curriculum will hate this presentation that you're watching. Not because it's factually wrong, but because they really don't want you as a parent to be fully aware of what's happening. Otherwise, they would have consulted with you when developing it. But they didn't, did they? As a parent or caregiver, it's our job to be a voice our children trust the most on the topic of relationships and sex. Let's be courageous and talk about sex and relationships, about marriage and abstinence, about respect and consent with our children. Be the loudest voice on this topic. Let's not leave the door open for our children to be taught about sexuality and gender theory by the voices of people whose agendas and values don't align with ours. It's time to push back for the sake of our children.